Okay, hi there, Year 4. I'm sorry that I hadn't been able to get more of the scrolls recorded before the weekend, but we can move on now with Scroll 5. I hope you're enjoying the story so far. Certainly picking up now that we've got a few more of the characters. We ended the fourth scroll with a dinner party, if you remember, celebrating Flavia's birthday. And at one point, Nubia, the slave girl who has just joined the family, has disappeared. Nubia was not in her chair. She had vanished. So that was the end of Scroll 4. And we'll move on now with Scroll 5. "Oh no! I knew it would all be too much for her," cried Flavia. "She only came off the slave ship this morning." "Don't worry," said Mordecai. "Perhaps the food was too rich for her. She may be in the latrine." Latrine is a toilet. So if the food was a bit too rich for her, she may have needed the loo. When Flavia reported that Nubia wasn't there, they all began to worry and decided to search the house. Still wearing their party garlands, Mordecai and Flavia's father looked downstairs, while Jonathan, Miriam and Flavia searched the upstairs bedrooms. The doorkeeper, Caudex, dozing in the atrium, swore that no one had gone out. Alma, scrubbing plates in the kitchen, had the back door constantly in her line of sight. She was sure Nubia had not gone near it. When they had searched the whole house, they met in the atrium by the household shrine. "Before we begin the search outside," said Flavia's father, gravely removing his garland, "have we checked every room?" "Yes," said the children. "Yes," nodded Mordecai. "No," said Caudex slowly, scratching his armpit. They all gazed at the big slave. "Scuto's still shut up in the storeroom," he mumbled. "He was whining and scratching to be let out, but—" "Yes," they cried. And then he all went very quiet. They all hurried to the storeroom, and cautiously Captain Geminus opened the door. By now it was dusk, and the storeroom, which had no windows, was dim and shadowy. They could just make out the shapes of dozens of storage jars full of wine and grain, half buried in the sandy earth to keep them from toppling over. "I think I see him," said Flavia's father. "Bring a lamp." Alma rushed to hand him a clay oil lamp, and the captain stepped into the storeroom. "Great Neptune's beard!" he exclaimed softly. In the golden lamplight, they saw Nubia and Scuto curled up asleep on the sandy floor. The girl's dark head rested on the dog's broad woolly back. She had placed her flowered garland on his head. As they all crowded into the doorway, Scuto raised his big head, with the garland slightly askew. He looked at them drowsily, sighed deeply, and went back to sleep. One bright afternoon, a few days later, Flavia's new friends accompanied her to the river harbour to see her father off on a voyage. Dr. Mordecai and Captain Geminus led the way. They looked an unlikely pair, Flavia thought, as she watched them walking and talking together. Her fair-haired Roman father in his tunic and blue cloak, the doctor with his exotic turban, robe and beard. But they had a common passion: travel. Mordecai had lived in Babylon and Jerusalem, two cities her father had never visited, and Captain Geminus had seen many countries which Mordecai had only read about. Flavia was glad they liked each other, because in only a few days she and Jonathan had also become firm friends. Jonathan had been coming to her house every morning to help teach Nubia Latin. He and Flavia had been reading the Aeneid to her, often stopping to explain or act out words. Jonathan was very funny and made them both laugh. Flavia thought it was good for Nubia to laugh. If you think about it, she's been a slave and taken from her home country by the rather appalling Venalicius. If anyone needs to laugh, it's that young woman. Now, as they made their way towards the river Tiber, Nubia was walking between Flavia and Jonathan, holding Scuto's lead. Since the night of the dinner party, the slave girl and the dog had been inseparable. She even refused to sleep in the new bed they had brought up to Flavia's room. Instead, Nubia curled up every night in the garden with Scuto and slept under the stars. Also walking with them to the docks was her father's patron, Titus Cordius Atticus, who had chartered her father's ship for a 2-week voyage to Greece. He intended to visit the town of Corinth to buy pottery, perfume, and bronzes. So Corinth, a really important Greek city, and a patron is somebody who takes responsibility for a voyage, who perhaps is somebody who gives work to a captain to supply them with money, to supply them with jobs. And so a patron was really important to somebody who wanted to have a healthy shipping fleet and to make money. Cordius, the patron, was a very wealthy merchant who lived opposite them in one of the largest and most beautiful houses in Ostia. He also had a townhouse in Rome and an estate on the island of Sicily. But despite his wealth, he always seemed very sad. Flavia's father had once told her the reason. While Cordius had been serving as an officer in Germania, his whole family had been slaughtered by barbarians. A lovely wife, 3 fine young sons, and a baby girl, now all gone to the underworld, and no one to leave his great riches to. Cordius doesn't need to work as a merchant, her father had said, but since he lost his family, there is a deep restlessness in him. I think he travels to get away from his empty houses. All the wealth in the world is no good if you don't have a family. Her father had hugged her tightly. Recently, however, Cordius had seemed more cheerful. Sometimes his stern face even relaxed into a smile. Flavia knew why, but she had been sworn to secrecy. Cordius was considering adopting his young freedman, Libitus. The word Libitus coming from liberty, coming from freedom. So Libitus will have been a slave, but Cordius will have freed him, which happened in Roman society. She had overheard the rich merchant discussing it with her father. "You mustn't tell a soul," Flavia's father had warned her. "He is still thinking about it, and no one knows, not even Libitus." Previously a slave in Cordius's household, Libitus had shown such skill and promise that he had been set free. Now a freed man, he still lived and worked in his patron's house, but now he was paid for it. Flavia considered that Libitus would make some girl a fine husband. He had straight black hair, clear skin, and dark blue eyes. He was young, intelligent, and charming. Furthermore, if Cordius adopted Libitus, one day he would be incredibly wealthy. And so Flavia was delighted to see Libitus walking beside Jonathan's sister Miriam. She thought they made a dazzling couple and wondered if the young freedman was telling Miriam that her eyes were like amethysts and her skin like alabaster. They would be flattering her. Amethysts, of course, a precious jewel, and alabaster would be the sort of plaster that would be very white, and so he would be saying that her skin was beautifully pale. Then she heard him say something about slavery in Judea and sighed. Libitus was definitely not wooing Miriam. As they emerged from between 2 warehouses and stepped onto the quayside, Flavia took a deep breath of the salty air. Seagulls and swifts soared and swooped above the river. Sailors and dockers rolled barrels and wine jars. Slaves loaded crates on carts, and soldiers marched past. And this was the quietest time of day. The harbour always made Flavia feel both excited and sad. Excited because every ship promised a new adventure. Sad because her father so often went away. The sight of her father's small ship, the Myrtilla, also made Flavia sad. Myrtilla had been the name of her mother, who had died in childbirth when Flavia was only 3 years old. The twin baby boys had died too. Flavia had been left alone with only her father and nurse Alma. As they approached the Myrtilla's berth, 3 burly Phoenician brothers shouted their greetings from various parts of the ship. They were called Quartus, Quintus, and Sextus. 4th, 5th, and 6th, Quartus, Quintus, and Sextus. The 4th crew member was an Ethiopian named Ebenus. Ethiopia is East Africa. His oiled, cheerful face rose up from the hold when he heard the others. Her father and the merchant Claudius had already stowed their belongings on board the ship. They had visited the temple of Castor and Pollux to make sacrifice for a good and profitable journey. Now the wind was favourable, and it was time for them to depart. Captain Geminus bounded up the boarding plank to make some last-minute checks aboard the ship, while Claudius gave Libytus some final instructions. Flavia was disappointed to see the handsome freedman hurry home shortly afterwards. She noticed Miriam watching Libytus until he was out of sight. Suddenly, Flavia noted that Nubia had begun to tremble uncontrollably. The docks obviously upset her. The slave girl hugged Scuto for reassurance, and his wet kisses seemed to calm her. A few moments later, Captain Geminus came down the boarding plank and put one arm around Flavia's shoulder. "Time for me to go," he said with a smile, and then added gravely, "You know, I'm a little worried about your safety since that incident with the dogs. Your tutor isn't here to look out for you this month. Cowdex can be terribly slow, and I don't know what Alma would do to protect you against a pack of wild dogs, or even kidnappers. Don't worry, Pater. I'm not alone. Dr. Mordecai lives next door, and I have Jonathan and Nubia to keep me company now. And there's Scuto. Ah, yes, the fierce watchdog." They looked down at Scuto, who was lathering Nubia's face with his wet tongue. So he's obviously not that fierce a guard dog. Smiling, Captain Geminus shook his head. "Well, if I hear you've been in the least danger, I'm packing you off to my brother's the next time I go on a voyage." "Don't worry, Pater. Jonathan and I will sit quietly in the garden all day and take turns reading the Aeneid to Nubia. We're teaching her Latin." She pulled Nubia close and put a protective arm around her. Good. Flavia's father quickly kissed her on the top of her head, said goodbye to the rest of them, and then he and Claudius boarded the ship. Using oars, the crew soon manoeuvred the small ship out of her berth and into the river channel. As the swift current carried the Myrtilla down towards the river mouth, Flavia's father stood at the helm, holding the steering paddle. Although Flavia usually stayed to watch until the Myrtilla passed out of sight, Nubia was trembling again, so Flavia decided to take her home quickly. Her father was busy at the helm, but just before they started back, Flavia saw him turn and wave one last time. It was still early afternoon when they returned to Green Fountain Street. Theirs was one of the few quiet residential streets in the bustling town, and now, at the hottest time of the day, it was almost deserted. Only Libytus stood at the communal fountain in the middle of the crossroads. They waved as they walked past, and Flavia noticed Miriam gave him a shy smile. As soon as they had left the docks, Nubia had stopped trembling. Now Jonathan was walking beside her and teaching her words in Latin by pointing at objects and saying their names. "Door," he said. "Door," she repeated. "Lion," he indicated a bronze door knocker. "Lion." "Curb." "Curb." "Fountain." "Fountain." "Water." "Yes, water, good," encouraged Jonathan. "Street." "Street." "Don't step in that." "Don't step in..." "Well, That looks like horse dung, but people empty their chamber pots here and it's pretty wet. So I think we'd better go back on the pavement. A chamber pot is a pot that one might keep under the bed so that you can go to the toilet in the night without going down to the latrine. So what he's talking about is the fact that they might have emptied their human number ones and twos out on the street. And it's best to avoid that. Nubia looked at him solemnly. Pavement, said Jonathan. Pavement, repeated Nubia. Oh, what's this? Blood? Blood, said Nubia, and pointed at the trail of drops that led to Jonathan's front door.